Chapter 14 introduces the concept of macroevolution. Now, in a previous chapter, you learned that microevolution is evolution on a small scale, which is defined as a change in a population's gene pool. And there are 5 causes of microevolution, okay? Genetic drift, selection, etc. Now, macroevolution can be defined as an origin of a new taxonomic group, which can include the origin of a new species. So speciation is really the splitting of populations of a species into species. Now, from the start, it needs to be understood that macroevolution cannot occur unless there is first microevolution. There are no different causes here. It's just a difference in perspective. Okay? The micro causes the macro given enough time in sufficient conditions. Now, the definition of a species. Generally speaking, species consist of individual populations. The individuals are capable of interbreeding in nature, but are reproductively isolated. That is, they are not able to interbreed with those of different species. So read the definition that I have in the notes. Now, Section 3 discusses these reproductive isolation mechanisms that occur in nature that keep species from successfully interbreeding. There are 2 general categories. Prezygotic prevents fertilization. Postzygotic fertilization happens, but the hybrid is not successful. Now, there are 5 prezygotic mechanisms in your notes and in your book. Habitat isolation. 2 species don't interbreed because they breed in different habitats. Temporal isolation. 2 species do not interbreed because they breed at different times. Behavioral isolation. 2 species do not interbreed because their courtship behaviors are not compatible with each other. Mechanical isolation. They can't interbreed because of a physical or anatomical barrier to mating. And gamete isolation, even if the gametes, the eggs and sperm, were in the same place at the same time, they simply don't fertilize because they don't recognize each other on the cellular level. This is important for species that spawn in water. Now, I'll give you examples in your notes and in your book. You need to look at them as well. With postzygotic, the hybrid is not successful with breeding with other hybrids or with either parent species. In the case of hybrid inviability, the hybrid either doesn't develop or is too frail. In the case of hybrid sterility, the hybrid is healthy but cannot successfully produce eggs or sperm. Reproductively sterile. The mule is an example of that. Hybrid breakdown occurs if the hybrid is healthy and is fertile but attempts to interbreed with either parent species or with each other, breaks down in the next generation because of being inviable or sterile or some other problem. So, for speciation to occur between populations, there has to be the origin of a reproductive isolating barrier where it didn't exist before. Now, mechanisms of speciation are discussed in your book. The 2 primary ways that are discussed are allopatric and sympatric. The word allopatric means different place. This is when populations are separated by a geographic barrier. Now, suppose we had a population here that suddenly became isolated by a geographic barrier, and that they don't go from one population to the next anymore. Now, what can happen in this one? Microevolution, drift, selection, whatever. What can happen in this one? Microevolution, drift, selection, whatever. What happens is that they are undergoing microevolution independently, and they become more and more genetically different from each other. And if they become genetically different enough to where they are no longer interfertile, even if they do coexist in the same place, then they have speciated. In this section in your book, it discusses some examples of the antelope squirrel separated by the Grand Canyon, the snapping shrimp species pairs that are separated by the Isthmus of Panama, and there are plenty of other examples as well. Sympatric speciation means same place. This is speciation without reproductive isolation. How does that happen? Well, your book discusses polyploidy, which is the accidental doubling or tripling or quadrupling of chromosome numbers in plants, in which case they're not interfertile with the groups they came from anymore, but can themselves be a viable species. Another cause of sympatric speciation can be very strong diversifying selection. Look it up in the previous chapter on selection, modes of selection, where one of them is diversifying. If it's strong enough to eliminate the middle, then they've speciated. That's the case with the apple maggot fly. Read that in your notes. Section 8, it discusses adaptive radiation. This is the relatively rapid production of many species from a few or one. Now, it can be sympatric or allopatric, doesn't matter. ocean island chains are kind of hot spots for adaptive radiation, such as the finches of the Galapagos Islands. So suppose you had a mainland and 4 islands in a chain. And we have ancestral species A, which had a population come over here, allopatrically speciate to B, and then some move over here to become C. Some of C move back over here to become D. Others of C may move over here to become E. Some of E may move over here to become F, and some of F may come over here to become G, and some of E may become H. So now we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species in island chains. Island chains are good spots for this. Now, the last section I cover in the notes is section 11 on how fast or slow evolution occurs over time. Now, really, when it comes to speciation, one size does not fit all. Just because organisms are geographically isolated doesn't mean that populations have to speciate. There have been cases where speciation has occurred within a few centuries or even a few decades, and other cases where it hasn't occurred at all after millions of years. But the point is that they don't all go at the same rate. Now, Darwin believed in gradualism. He believed that evolutionary rates overall were slow, steady, gradual, and constant. The problem with that was the fossil record. It doesn't show slow, steady, gradual, constant, but jumpy, 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 jumpy. Years later, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould in 1970 or something like that came up with punctuated equilibrium. The idea of punctuated equilibrium is that you have relatively long periods of time with a status quo and not a whole lot of major changes, evolutionarily speaking, going on. Then the status quo gets seriously interrupted by an event and caused or led to adaptive radiation. So this is used to explain, say, mass extinction events caused by adaptive radiation of the survivors, and that'll be elaborated in a later chapter. And that concludes the review of Chapter 14. Be sure to study your notes and refer to the book where the notes refer you to.